For my lesson, my flipped lesson, I'll be doing it on the principles of animation and just explaining what they are and how they can be used in your own animation works to bring your characters and animations to life and make them more believable. The principles of animation were created by a couple of animators in Disney in 1939, and that's what helped Disney just become a booming sensation in animation. And these 12 animation principles, they're not strict rules, but they've had such an impact on the culture of animation that everybody who does animation since follows these rules. They're just pretty good. Let's start off with the first one. The squash and stretch is the first principle of animation, and it's arguably the most important because it gives your characters and objects mass and weight and gravity, and just gives them life. So in my example, I've got a bouncing ball, and in the first one it's bouncing but it doesn't change its shape, and it's kind of a bit boring. But in the second one, the ball seems to have a little bit of life in it. You can see as gravity is pulling it, it's stretching towards the ground, and then when it hits the ground, it squashes as it's bouncing, and then it bounces back up and then stretches out again as it continues on its arc. At this point, I'd get the students to do an example, because this principle is not just applied to objects like a ball. You can apply it to your characters, such as their faces or their bodies, such as like a chubby character walking along and you'd squash their body for comical effect, or if a character is chewing. So I'd get the students to pretend they're chewing something and examine each other's faces, how they naturally squash and stretch. I'll give you an example. Like when you're chewing, your jaw goes down, and then your cheeks puff out if you exaggerate it a little bit, and that's another point in the principles of animation we'll get to later. So continuing on, we have anticipation. And anticipation prepares the viewer for what's about to happen, for the action that's about to happen, and it's also a build-up for the character's animation. So in my example, we see Donald, and he's building up, he's about to run, and so you imagine actions that you do yourself, such as if you're trying to jump, you wouldn't be able to jump without bending your knees. I'm not sure if it would even be possible. Or when you're about to throw a ball, you do a big wind up, ready to throw it. The next principle of animation is staging, and this one is a lot like composition in art, where you want your focus to be the primary point that the viewers are seeing. So you leave everything else to a minimum, and such as movement and motion, and so the background complements your focus. The next one is fourth principle of animation is straight ahead and pose to pose. What these refer to are two different types of drawing animation. The first one, straight ahead, is when an artist will draw frame by frame every frame, and this helps to create consistency and really fluid motion. The next one is pose to pose. That's where a lead animator will do poses on key frames and miss out in between, and then an understudy will come and fill in those missing frames in between the poses. The next one is follow through and overlapping action. So when you're, like, say a character's walking, follow through would be such as your arms moving. Not all objects, when you're moving, like such as a person, they won't all move at the exact same time. So as your character's walking, you have your arms swinging. That's follow through. And then overlapping action, such as my example, is such as a kite, it's blowing in the wind, and then the tails of the kite, they're following as it's flying along in that direction, but then the wind suddenly changes direction, so the kite pulls the other way, but the tail momentarily flings out in that same direction before it can follow the kite. And that would apply to such as a character running. They'd be moving, and when they stop, their hair or perhaps their clothes will still continue on that motion momentarily before settling back down. The next principle, the sixth principle of animation, is slow in and slow out. Because when we do movements, they're not fast, jerky movements. Some machinery can, but even that has like a build-up time, such as a car, for example. You start up a car and you take off. It starts off slow, and then you're driving. It's consistent, and then you want to stop. You put the brake on, and you slow down. So in this example, I've used a pendulum, and as it's swinging, you can see as it's reaching the apex of its point, it slows down, and then at that point it stops and then comes back the other way. So that's a real world application of physics in animation. The next example is arc, the seventh principle of animation, and that's another example of physics, real world physics in animation, such as an object, a bouncing ball, when gravity works on it, it would flow in a natural arc. But also a character's movements, such as their arms swinging, they'll use arcs as well. So I'd get the students to do an example where they could walk around the room and observe each other's or their own arms moving and their legs, and see how their own body is naturally moving in an arc. And that would apply to any movement. When you're grabbing something, like taking a drink, and then you bring it up, it's not really a robotic action, because that would make it look kind of unnatural. The eighth example is secondary action, and this refers to you have your main animation, such as your character doing a motion, like an action, and then you'd have other like minor actions that complement that action, but you don't want to take the focus off your main action. So for my example here, I've got Tigger bouncing, because that's what he does, that's what he's known for. But then also a secondary action, you can see his tail. As he's bouncing, his tail's up, and then gravity brings it down as he's jumping up. And that would apply to hair, such as character walking, and then their hair might be slowly, gently moving, or clothes. The next principle of animation is timing, and for this one I've used an example of a box. So imagine this box has weight to it and mass, and you're trying to push that box. In the first example, it's a very unrealistic action that the box would just move in a linear line, like perfectly. You'd start off, you'd be pushing it, and then you'd have to put your weight into it. You'd start off slow, and then you get momentum, and then you push it, and then when you're getting it to where you need to go, you have to slow down that momentum. It's very similar to the slow in and slow out, but it also helps to create an idea of the object's mass. The next example, number 10, 10th principle of animation, is exaggeration. When you have animations, sometimes you want them to be a little bit larger than life, and some movements are maybe a little bit too subtle for an animation. Like in a movie they'd work fine, but in an animation they could be missed. And so lots of your motions you can just exaggerate a little bit to make them pop. and you can put an emphasis on it, such as this example. If you hit someone on the head with a frying pan, you wouldn't really jump in the air. You could if you wanted to. And then he brings it down and he squashes, and then it's bringing that first principle into action again, where he's squashed his body. He's come down. The 11th principle of animation is solid drawing, and for this principle it refers to that you need an idea of how to draw in 3D space and have a good knowledge of like anatomy and scale. So for this one I've used Homer Simpson, and we have the lines, and that helps to build up the scale. And in the first example you can see he's just made up of a bunch of shapes, and then we use that scale to create the finished version of him. And the final 12th animation principle is appeal. And there's no set rules for this one, but you want your characters and your animation to appeal to the audience. So it can be as detailed as you like, such as my example. We have Mickey. It's not super detailed, but it's pretty good. And then you can have really simple examples, such as this little Eggman. And all it is just a couple of lines. But both of those characters are just as appealing as each other. And so if you apply all these principles, you wouldn't apply them all at the same time. That might be difficult. You could, but they work really well in conjunction with each other, and they just help to improve your quality of work and the realism and entertainment of your animation.